Okay, so I'll just go over what we're going to cover a little bit here. I'm going to sort of breeze through some of the flycatcher groups that you may already be familiar with, but they're fairly distinctive, and such as kingbirds and the Myiarchus, flycatchers, Phoebes, and then I'm going to get to pewees, which is the genus Contopus, and Empids, which is a short term for the genus Empidonax. And these are all, I'm going to go through flycatchers that you can find in Colorado at some time of the year. A lot of them are breeders. Some of them just pass through as migrants. So I'm going to breeze through the kingbirds and Myiarchus and Phoebes. Then I'm going to go through Empidonax and talk about identification. Mostly, I'm going to talk about visual identification, plumage differences. We'll go into sound a little bit, and I think I'll even share some recordings from Xenocanto, which is an excellent database of sound database. And then we'll have a couple of quizzes, so that should be fun. I'll go through behavior as a tool for identification, and yeah, after quizzes, and then I'll go through sound, and then I envision we'll have quite a bit of time for questions, which I will be very happy to answer. And there will be time for questions along the way as well. Great. Here we go. Okay, so here in Colorado, we've got 3 species of kingbird that that breed here in the state. We've got eastern kingbirds, we've got western kingbird and Cassin's kingbird. This is the genus Tyrannus. I didn't put that on the slide, but that's what they call it. So eastern kingbird is pretty distinctive for a flycatcher. You can see black and white, and it's got that white tail tip that you often see kind of strikingly when it flies, at least from the backside. And we've got, it sounds like someone's unmuted here. If you could, yeah, awesome. Let's see. Yeah, and then we've got western kingbird and Cassin's kingbird. So western kingbird is really widespread, and you can find it just about anywhere in Colorado in open areas. Usually not above 7,000, 8,000 feet. But then Cassin's kingbirds are more localized here. So we get them in the southeast, in pinyon juniper woodlands. But as you can see, there's like quite a few similarities between these two. So they're both yellow-bellied kingbirds. But there's a few key differences, and I'll just point them out briefly here. As you can see, can you see my cursor, by the way? Nick or anyone? Yeah. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so in western kingbirds, you can see this little white outer tail feather. So that's the edge of its outer tail feather. And that mark that's missing on Cassin's kingbird. You can see here, there's no white. Cassin's will sometimes have a kind of white tip instead. But sometimes the tails are worn or a little bit bleached to the tip, so it can get a little confusing for just that mark. But I think the biggest difference here between western and Cassin's kingbirds are just like the overall, the kingbirds are really dark when you look at them. these two photos might be a little bit overexposed, but gray than Western Kingbird on the head here, as you can see. And another thing, and which kind of makes so in Western Kingbird, the pale head kind of makes this dark marking on the through the eye and into the ear coverts, which is this area right here. It makes it kind of more contrasting. And then the same can actually be said for Cassin's kingbird, but just with the chin. So you can see this white chin that really contrasts well with the dark head and dark back and wings. And you can see that a little more here as well. So up on the left here, you can, I don't have them labeled, so maybe you can guess what they are. But I'll tell you. So this is a Western Kingbird up on the left. It's got a pale head. It's kind of got a contrasting dark spot through the eyes. The white in the chin isn't as contrasting as in Cassin's kingbird. And another thing, actually, I may as well point this out. The mantle here on Western Kingbird, which refers to the back, is a sort of pale green, which you don't see that very well on Cassin's kingbird. See, in this picture, you can kind of see it's pretty gray. It doesn't really contrast at all with the rest of the head. So just think like really dark gray for Cassin's kingbird. And I wasn't going to go through sounds for these, but they sound quite different too. Western kingbird, Cassin's kingbird, and Eastern kingbird. And let's see. I think that's all I wanted to mention for these. So here we've got the Myiarchus flycatchers, which that's the genus name. That's the name of the genus for two species that actually both of these breed in Colorado. The first is here ash-throated flycatcher. So this is the more spread species in Colorado. We get them throughout the southeastern part of the state, up until into Colorado Springs. We get them kind of all throughout the west slope and kind of lower elevation pinyon juniper woodlands, which are really dry, kind of short trees. And then we've got gray-crested flycatchers, which you'll come across in migration sometimes on the eastern plains. Your chances are better the further east you go, but they're quite similar. So, well, I should mention that there's breeding records in Colorado, but I don't think they don't breed extensively. So gray-crested flycatchers are a little darker in the head, and I've only got this one photo here. I'm not going to spend too much time on Myiarchus because there's more, in my opinion, more fascinating aspects that I will get into. But gray-crested flycatcher is a little bit larger build and darker in the head. So it's kind of got a grayish cheek color. And I don't know how well that is demonstrated in these photos in particular. But they also sound quite different. Ash-throated flycatcher and gray-crested flycatcher, which is actually, that's how I identify them in the field most of the time, is by sound. I think it's an easier way, especially with a lot of these flycatchers, as you'll find out pretty soon. Right. And then the Phoebes. Okay. Let me just move my. Sweet. Okay, so we've got 3 species of Phoebes in Colorado. The widespread species that you may have seen before, you might be familiar with, this is Say's Phoebe. Kind of a striking Phoebe in my opinion, or it's subtly striking, kind of peachy below, brown above. These breed throughout Colorado, on the plains and up in the mountains in open areas. And you get them in migration too. And then we've got black phoebes in southern Colorado at lower elevations, which are a close sister species to eastern phoebe down here on the bottom right. And eastern phoebe actually breeds in southeastern Colorado quite a bit, and there's breeding records across the Front Range. But April is a really good time to get eastern phoebes. Well, actually, it's a good time to get all three of the phoebes, but they're relatively distinctive. Sometimes black phoebe and eastern phoebe will hybridize, which I think is kind of cool, where they overlap in because they'll breed in the same habitats in southeastern Colorado. Yeah, and as you can see here, black phoebe's got black extending onto the chest and in the throat. Eastern phoebe is pale in that same area, and just kind of brown overall, as opposed to black. Yeah. And here we have the pewees. Okay, so this is genus Cantopus. And this is interesting. So this includes 3 species in well, sort of 2 species, but I'll get into that. So olive-sided flycatcher, which in my opinion, it really should be called olive-sided pewee, or maybe boreal pewee or something, just for the lack of confusion, because it is a pewee. It's a Cantopus flycatcher. And then we've got western wood-pewee and eastern wood-pewee, and I'll just refer to these as the wood-pewees from here on out. But the vast majority of our pewees in Colorado are western wood-pewees. Eastern is quite rare, and once in a while people will find them on the eastern plains in migration. But they're essentially unidentifiable except by voice. And we'll get into voice more a little bit later. So let's see. Yeah, okay. So for olive-sided flycatcher, I want you to pay attention to a few things. So first, look at this vest. So this is what we refer to is the vest of olive-sided flycatcher. It's got this white, contrasting white through the middle, through the chest and the underparts, with kind of a dark, this is what we call the vest. That contrasts really nicely. You can see that in both of these pictures on the top, and not as much on the lower picture because of the angle. And then, as you can see in western wood-pewee, we don't really see that. It's kind of a really there's almost no contrast. Sometimes in some other photos it doesn't demonstrate, but sometimes they'll be a little contrasty. So you just have to be careful and use multiple field marks to identify the. And that's really a lot of flycatcher identification, is using multiple field marks, and preferably voice a lot of the time. But I'll show you instances where voice is more helpful, and sometimes visuals are more helpful.
But okay, so a few other things I want to point out in olive-sided flycatcher. So they've got a really massive bill. If you compare it to wood-pewees, like look at this bill. In the field, sometimes it's more apparent, but so it's big billed, it's short-tailed. So look at this wood-pewee here. They've got kind of a long tail if you compare it to really any one of these olive-sided flycatchers. So they've got they're overall just chunkier. They just look bigger, and they've got a bigger bill. They've kind of got a shorter tail, just kind of larger chested. And then there's that striking vest that you see. And so I'll mention you can find olive-sided flycatchers sometimes in migration in Colorado, and they breed a little bit up in the at high elevations in the Rockies here, but they're kind of low density. We don't get nearly as many olive-sided flycatchers as we get wood-pewees. So a big ratio, a big portion of your flycatchers are going to be wood-pewees. And almost all of those are going to be Western wood-pewees. And something else I'll just point out, and this goes for both of these, is the primary projection. So, well, I have a slide for this later. I'll save it for another slide, which is right here, actually. So empids versus pewees. So I'm going to get into empids pretty soon. But I want to point out a few things because pewees and empids can get confused pretty easily. And yeah, so pewees are darker and they're grayer. They're like less, you won't really see any color in a pewee for the most part. And let me go back a slide. Actually, this one you see it's kind of brownish, but that's because it's actually a juvenile. I photographed that one in North Dakota, and it was actually begging. So sometimes the young birds will look a little bit brown, but otherwise they're very gray. I really like this photo here because it demonstrates that really well. And another thing it really demonstrates well is the wing bars. So they've kind of got dull wing bars, and as you can see, this upper wing bar here is really dull compared to this lower wing bar. And that's actually a subtle difference. That's actually a field mark that sometimes separates Western wood-pewee from Eastern wood-pewee. So Eastern wood-pewees will have a little bit brighter wing bars, but you shouldn't identify wood-pewees normally that way, just by one mark because there's overlap. But what I will say is both wood-pewees, Eastern and Western wood-pewee, have really dull wing bars compared to empids. The empids will have kind of brighter wing bars. So they're really dull, dark gray. They've got really weak wing bars. And then maybe the biggest thing I want to point out here is the primary projection. So, and this photo demonstrates it. So if you can see this is where the tip of the primaries are. And when I say the primaries, I mean the primary flight feathers, which are there are these feathers right here that you can see on the perched bird. These dark feathers, not these light edged feathers. So these are the secondaries, and then the tertials. These are the secondaries. So when I refer to primary projection, what I'm referring to is how far the primaries extend past these secondaries here. So that's the distance from here to there. And as you can see on this bird, it's almost half the length of the tail. Sometimes they'll look a little bit shorter, It might sometimes look a little bit longer, but the idea is that it's a really long primary projection when we're talking about flycatchers. Oh, and one last thing, pewees, they kind of lack in eye-ring. I'll get into that a little later, but this is a mark you might have heard or may not have heard, but that's something that we look on Empids a bit. That's something that we look for on Empids a bit, but yeah. And I'll show you some more of that. Oh, and this photo was just fun because, well, for one, it kind of demonstrates how long the primaries are. So this is a wood-pewee that's missing all of its tail feathers, as you can see here. You know, it must have gotten into a squabble with a sharp-shinned hawk or something, and just barely made it out. But these are the wings, and you can see just really how long they are. So, all right. And then the moment we've all been waiting for, the Empids. And I just want to say, yeah, everyone struggles with Empids. There's no one quick and dirty way to identify Empids. So it just takes a lot of practice. In the field and doing comparisons online, but in the field is always best. And identifying Empids is not as hard as difficult as this chart depicts. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's not that bad. And Empidonax Empidonax SB is an option in eBird. If we're talking in eBird terms, for those of you who use eBird, I will say that Empidonax is really a great option to use if you're just unsure. And I use it a lot. You know, when I don't get good looks of the bird or get good sounds, it's not vocalizing. Yeah, so I'm going to go through all the Empids that breed in Colorado and that regularly pass through Colorado, and just talk about what makes them different visually. And then we'll get into sounds a little bit. But I'm going through these Empids sort of by date, roughly. So gray flycatcher is the first Empid to arrive in Colorado. Often you get them in April, showing up, but they breed in pinyon juniper woodlands, mostly in the southern part of the state, the southeast, and all throughout the west slope in pinyon juniper woodlands. So it's a pretty dry, it's a pretty arid habitat. And so as the name implies, you know, they really are quite gray, in my opinion. Let me put it this way. They're gray when they migrate into the US from Mexico. So they molt into fresh plumage on wintering grounds, and that's not when we see them here. So when we see them in the US coming through, usually they're just grayer. They've got a more worn plumage than a lot of the other Empids. So they just kind of look pale gray, kind of lacking brown tones that a lot of the other Empids will show. And then there's a few other things that I want to point out, and that is kind of the lack, or the really thin eye ring. I'll call it that. Sometimes it just doesn't look like an eye ring at all, but it's it's kind of just barely there, which is this kind of this thin white border of feathers around the eye. And another thing that makes it different, so from other empids, is the head. They're kind of smooth, flat-headed, and as we'll see later, and also with the pewees, a lot of flycatchers kind of have a crested look. The back of the head kind of peaks up a little bit, and that's not really the case in gray flycatchers at all, as you can see here. So that's a really great way. They've got a really smooth, round head. And another thing is the bill. And I'll mention when I talk about the bill length and the tail length, that's kind of subjective, and it's hard to really have anything to compare that to in the field. So it takes a lot of practice in the field to really notice some of those things. But I will say that they look longer, thinner billed, and longer tailed than other empids. But it's subtle, as most things are with empids. But another thing about the bill is they've got an entirely orange or pale lower mandible, which the mandible is, the birds have two mandibles, an upper mandible and a lower mandible that compose the bill. And so the lower mandible will be basically entirely orange, which is not the case with a lot of the other empids, with most of the other empids. So really entirely pale lower mandible, smooth, flat-headed appearance, long-tailed, really gray. And I might point out as well, so the primary projection here, look at how short that is compared to the wood-pewees we looked at earlier. So here's the tip of, or on this bird, here's the tip of the primary feathers. And then here's the tip of the secondary feathers, roughly right there. And look how long that tail is compared to that primary projection. Let's see. Yeah, and I'll open it up to questions in just a little bit. If anyone has questions at this point on gray flycatcher or on any of the previous flycatchers we talked about, I'll just pause here for maybe a minute, 2 minutes. If you want to talk about kingbirds, if you want to talk about Phoebes or Myiarchus flycatchers, any of those first groups that we talked about, before I really dive deeper into the empids. So if you want to type in chat, feel free to do that. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free to do that.
David, there's a question from Diana Beatty. Is there something about the wag of the tail on gray flycatchers?
Yes, there is. And I have slides. I was going to talk about this a little more later on. Yeah, but I'm glad she asked that. Thank you, Diana. So for gray flycatchers, behavior is a really good way to identify these in the field. And that's because they'll kind of wag their tails down. They'll dip their tails down quite a lot in the field. So all empids make tail movements and wing movements as they're perched and when they're flying around. The unique thing about gray flycatcher is they will dip their tail downwards first before taking it up at all. It just goes straight down. It goes down and then up again. But this is kind of hard. You have to be careful with this field mark. And I've witnessed this happen in the field before, where and I'm gonna tell you why, because other flycatchers like Dusky flycatcher, Cordilleran flycatcher, they also dip their tails downwards, but they wag their tail up ever so slightly first. They take their tail up and then down, but sometimes the downward movement is over exaggerated and kind of overshadows the upward tail movement. So sometimes it'll look a little deceiving and just look like a downward tail movement. So just be careful with that mark. Just I'd recommend using the downward tail dip along with some of the other visual pointers that I just showed you right here.
David, there's another question from Jeff Purcell. With Empids and pewees, can you talk about identifying by behavior?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, and that kind of ties into what I was talking about with the downward tail dip gray flycatcher too, because wood-pewees don't make tail movements and wing movements like Empids do. They're both flycatchers. They'll come to a perch and sit there for a while, but when they're on that perch, they don't really make wing or tail movement, which you'll see all of the Empids make some kind of wing or tail movement when they're perched. And well, there's also posture. So wood-pewees tend to be perched a little bit more upright than Empids do. But yeah, that's as far as I'd go on behavior right now. That's a good question.
One more question for you from Diana. I've heard that olive-sided tend to like tops of trees and wood-pewees tend to like snags lower on the trees. Do you think that is true?
Not entirely. Because I've seen wood-pewees at the tops of trees and seen olive-sided flycatchers lowered down. But I think that yes, a lot of the time olive-sided flycatchers are higher up than wood-pewees are. I think if you take averages and average it out, I think that would be the case. But I don't think that's not a mark you should use just by itself. But I'm glad you asked. That's a good question. Anything else?
Nope, not at the moment.
All right. Oh wait, feel free to ask more questions. We'll take about 20-30 more seconds and I'll move on. All right, well, I'll start talking about dusky flycatchers, so gray flycatchers, I told you gray flycatchers prefer pinon juniper woodlands. So if we're talking about habitat, dusky flycatchers breed in ponderosa pine and kind of just dry hillsides, but with bigger trees. So ponderosa pine forests throughout the Rockies. And they're kind of similar to gray flycatchers, even in terms, even when we're talking in terms of Empids. So yeah, I guess I kind of like to call them the second grayest Empid, just because they're kind of close to gray. But I mean, that's not really a field mark per se. So they're darker than gray, and usually you see more olive or kind of olive or brownish tones, usually kind of olive tones in the plumage. In this photo here, you can kind of see that. Not as much in these other two photos. And sometimes this is just a difference of plumage wear. So when the bird has molted into fresh plumage. And usually dusky flycatchers are in fresher plumage when we see them in migration and in breeding season in the summertime than gray flycatchers are. So Oh yeah, and I'll talk about the eye-ring too. So they've usually got an eye-ring, but this is kind of variable. I don't like that mark I don't love that mark for dusky flycatcher, as I do for some other empids. But you can see here, there's kind of a more defined eye-ring, so kind of more white around the eye than you see in gray flycatchers. It's really thin on these gray. Look at this bird. It's all just barely there. It's thin and it's kind of consistent, width. Whereas in dusky, you kind of see more white in the back and more white in the front than you do on the top or the bottom. And that's kind of what I mean when I say an almond-shaped eye-ring here. And kind of similar to gray flycatchers, they kind of have a flat head. I don't think the head doesn't always look as smooth as gray flycatcher, but they're pretty close. They're kind of flat-headed for an empid, kind of long-tailed, just like gray flycatcher. And then I'll move on to Hammond's flycatcher. So Hammond's flycatchers, they're not as common as dusky or gray flycatchers in Colorado. Although on the Front Range, they're more common than gray flycatchers, but not terribly important. So they breed in. Usually, I get them breeding in like Douglas fir or other fir kind of drainages with running water, as opposed they really seem to stick to water more and taller, shadier trees than dusky flycatchers do, and especially a lot more than gray flycatchers do, because gray flycatchers stick to pinyon juniper. But when I'm talking about habitat, I'm really just talking about in the breeding season. And I never went over that actually. So I might mention that. So right now today, May 30th, we're kind of at the very tail end of migration. So you might still get flycatchers out of habitat moving through as migrants. But they're starting to set up territory. A lot of them are on territory now, which means they're starting to breed. They'll be in the mountains. The ones that we've looked at so far mostly breed in the mountains. And so through the summer and through July, August, you can get them in the habitats that I'm describing. But let's look at in migration, you can't use habitat, and generally you shouldn't use habitat alone to identify flycatchers. But yeah, Hammond's flycatchers are really small, dark build, and I've got a really long, a long primary projection for an empid. So look at that. So here's the end of the secondaries right here, and then the tip of the primaries. And compare that to the tail. And what do we say? It's maybe just over a third of the length of the tail. It's pretty long compared to other empids. And I could separate this talk into empids in spring and then empids in fall. Because the thing about Hammond's flycatchers is in the fall they molt in the summer, in the late summer, and they get really bright plumage like this bird here. They almost, they can look like Cordilleran flycatcher, which we'll get to later. But most of the time they're kind of grayer headed than Cordilleran flycatcher. You don't see that as much on this picture, but in some others. So here's Hammond's too. There's some weird shadows and lighting going on, but the primary projection there is pretty long. Here is where the secondaries end. There's the tip of the primaries. It's got a small bill. It's usually just almost all dark, maybe a little bit of paleness at the base of the lower mandible, but usually they're really dark. And they've got this eye ring, kind of an almond-shaped eye ring. It looks like a dusky eye ring, looks like a Cordilleran eye-ring. You shouldn't use that alone to identify, well, you shouldn't really use that at all to identify Hammond's flycatcher other than it's present. And they've kind of got a little bit of a peak at the back of the head. And let's look at another picture. Here's another one. Here's a pretty small bill, kind of slightly peaked. It's not really smooth and rounded. It's bright below, but then it's grayer headed compared to this kind of yellowish tinge down here. And that's how it differs from Cordilleran flycatcher. Oh, and I'll mention too, since we're at Hammond's flycatcher and then least flycatcher. Well, actually, no, I'll say that for later. I'll just talk about least flycatcher now. So least flycatchers, in opposition to Hammond's, they've got really short primary projection. You can see here with some of these pictures. It's kind of more like a gray flycatcher primary projection. And this one kind of here, it's raising its tail. I got a photo with its tail kind of mid wag. And they're short. It takes a lot of pictures and a lot of in-field study to really notice it a lot when I'm talking about primary projection length. It's more noticeable in pewees how long the primary projection is in wood-pewees. But Hammond's flycatcher has a long primary projection. Least flycatcher has a really short primary projection. Then least flycatcher also kind of has a whitish throat. It kind of contrasts with the brown tones. So these brown tones in the head and in the mantle. See this, oh, I like this shot here. This middle shot and this top right shot. You can see that it's kind of brown olive tones in the mantle especially, and kind of in the head. But then when you look on the underside, it's pale. It contrasts well, and the throat is kind of whitish a lot of the time. And then they've got an eye ring. They just got a round eye ring. Usually, it's pretty round. It's pretty meaning that the back and the front of the eye ring don't extend as far out as it does in Dusky and Hammond's. So think of small, short primary projection, kind of short tail, kind of brown empid, kind of just small build for an empid. It's a small empid. That's why we call it least flycatcher, but not that much smaller. Cordilleran flycatcher. So this flycatcher breeds and throughout Colorado and in riparian zones throughout the mountains. So wherever there's running water in the mountains. Kind of similar habitat preference to Hammond's flycatcher, but usually more deciduous trees where you get Cordilleran flycatcher. Let me just mention least flycatcher. Least flycatchers don't breed widely in Colorado. They migrate through a lot, and you could still get them right now in late May. In late May, you could still get migrant least flycatchers moving through because they're one of the later migrants. But they don't breed very. There's scattered breeding records, but generally we only get them as a migrant in Colorado. Cordilleran flycatcher, on the other hand, breeds extensively here in the state, and they're also a later migrant, and they are Cordilleran flycatcher is our brightest Empid. So they're kind of, and when I say that, I mean kind of, there's yellow tones, but there's also they're really kind of olive greenish tinged. Like you can see in each of these photos, they're not, like, you couldn't call them gray, really. They've got an olive kind of greenish tone throughout. And then I want you to look at the eye ring. Look at the back of the eye, and how that eye ring just kind of points, kind of, I guess, almond shaped. But it's pointy. It's not perfectly smooth and round on this eye ring. On each of these photos, actually, it's demonstrated really well. There's kind of a point in the eye ring on the back side of the eye. And they look kind of crested. Like, look at this bird here. Depending on how excited the bird is, it might look a little more raised or a little more lowered, but you can definitely see that there's a little point in the back of the head. And if you compare that to least flycatcher, they're kind of one of the more rounded headed flycatchers. Yeah, so it's kind of crested for an Empid, but very, very bright, and that's the best takeaway. Entirely orange lower mandible. Cordilleran flycatcher and gray flycatcher share that in common, but otherwise they don't really look that similar, because in terms of brightness, they're on the opposite, or saturation, they're kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum. Okay. Traill's flycatcher. So this is an interesting one. So willow and alder flycatcher, they used to be lumped. They used to be considered the same species, and a species we knew as Traill's flycatcher. They were split sometime before 2000, and I'm not sure exactly when. But they're visually very difficult, almost impossible to tell apart. And the conventional wisdom is just don't tell them apart by sight. And they have distinctive calls and they have distinctive songs. But there's some nuance to the songs. There's you should identify these by voice for the most part. However, there's subtle differences between these, and I'm not going to get too deep into it. But I'll just mention, on average, willow flycatchers, especially the ones we have here in the West, there's a little bit browner than alder, a little bit more crested than alder, a little bit less of an eye ring, so that they've almost got no eye ring. But okay, let me back up. How to identify Traill's flycatcher compared to other Empids. So they're kind of large build, but I think the main thing that helps me a lot of times, there's basically no eye ring. It's kind of a brownish Empid with no eye ring. When you see a brownish Empid with no eye ring, that probably means it's a Traill's flycatcher. So, and it needs to be brownish. If it's gray, grayish, and it has like really long primary projection, you might be looking at Wood-pewee. But if you've determined it's an Empid, it's got short enough primary projection, and it's kind of brownish, it's got saturated tones in it, it could be a Traill's flycatcher. And these are later migrants in Colorado, and the vast majority of the birds we have in Colorado are willow flycatchers. So right now in late May, you could get willow flycatchers moving through. Alder flycatcher on the far eastern plains, and you should get a recording or something identify it by voice rather than sight, which goes for a lot of the Empids. And that brings me to sound, using sound to identify Empids in general. And we're almost at 8 here. So I might not go through all of these, but I'm going to separate the Empids into the wit calls and the pip calls. So, and you might be thinking, well, what is a wit? What does a pip sound like? And I'll show you I'll actually play you some recordings. And it takes practice just listening to these notes to really get a feel for it. But I'm separating these now because because gray flycatcher, dusky flycatcher, least flycatcher, willow flycatcher, they all give wit calls to sound the same. They look the same on spectrograms. They sound the same in the field to my ears. You shouldn't identify them by that. Like, you shouldn't separate these 4 species from each other just by that. But it's helpful for separating them versus Hammond's flycatcher and alder flycatcher give pip calls, which kind of sound qualitatively different. Both of these are single call notes. You have to be really careful. Cordilleran flycatcher is kind of an exception. It doesn't give either of those. It gives, I usually don't hear them make any sounds in migration. But sometimes they'll make really high pitched notes. And their song is really high pitched too. And I'm going to go to Xenocanto. I'm going to, I'll play a pip calls. That's a pip. So that's what Hammond's flycatcher sounds like. And they'll do that in migration. Let's compare it to alder flycatcher, which sounds almost the same. It's another pip call. Well, not that one. Let's see. Find it better. That's a different call. They make many different calls, but the one I want you to focus on is the pip call. Not that. Wait, this is perfect. Pip. So that's an alder flycatcher, and that's a common call type that they'll make in migration. So if you can get photos and recordings of an Empid that's making a pip call like that, then you're well on your way to identifying it down to species. Let's see here. So there's a wit. It's kind of, this recording is kind of quiet. Not that one. Right there. And can you hear these recordings? Just to make sure. Can anyone give me a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll just play that one more time. No, this one. That's a wit. It's kind of softer. It's
guess it's not as harsh as a pick. But it takes a little bit of just listening to these call notes to get a feel for them. And then down here, I mentioned, so Merlin Bird ID, so that the app has a lot of sounds on it, and Xenocanto. And I use those quite a bit just to compare sounds and to learn my Empids. Then there's another call type that Dusky Flycatcher, and this is especially for Dusky Flycatcher because they do this a lot in migration. They give a kind of a 2-wheat call, which I like to call it. Hammonds don't really make that call type that much, well, or their equivalent, I should say. But it's more of a 2-wheat woot, like it's kind of 3 notes. And we're past 8 now, so I'm not going to show you recordings unless someone wants me to come back to it a little bit later when we're at questions. I'll happily show recordings of these call types. Yeah, so here we are back at behavior again. Yeah. So as I already mentioned, all Empids make some kind of tail and wing movement, and which kind of makes them unique from Wood-pewees and a lot of other flycatchers, except Phoebes. So the Phoebes we talked about earlier, which look quite different, but this is just an interesting an observation, is that they do make downward tail dips, much like gray flycatchers. You see, it's kind of the same movement. It's a downward tail dip. So Phoebes do that a lot, as do gray flycatchers. And I want you to be careful with that mark for gray flycatcher, because some the other Empids, Dusky Flycatcher, Cordilleran Flycatcher, well, especially those two, they'll make tail movements without moving their wings at all. And sometimes it can just look like a downward tail dip. But if you really look closely, you'll kind of notice that the tail goes up before it goes down. It goes up before it goes down in Dusky and Cordilleran. And the same can be said for willow, for the Traill's flycatcher. Traill's flycatcher, which refers to willow and alder flycatcher. Least flycatchers in the field, they make a lot of wing and tail movement, and often, well, usually simultaneously, actually. So they'll kind of make constant wing flicking kind of in the field, which is a good way to kind of know, oh, okay, so that's a Hammond's or a least. And I've kind of got a cheat sheet here. Breaks it down a little bit.
David, can you take a question?
Yeah, definitely.
Bob Shade asks whether Empids sing during migration before arriving on territory. For example, do least flycatcher do Quebec in migration?
Yes, that's a good question. And least flycatcher do sing. They do make Quebec songs during migration, but they don't always. Not always. In fact, most of the time they don't. But yeah, that's a good point. And if you want, I think as we get to questions at the end, I can even play least flycatcher and the Quebec song that they give, if anyone would like that. And I hope that answers the question. All right, so now I've got a few quizzes for you to test your knowledge and to see what you've learned. So I'm gonna give about
2 minutes, maybe just under 2 minutes, a minute and a half, let's say. And just think about this. You don't need to put it in chat. You don't need to blurt out the answer right away, or say it. Just think about it to yourself. Try to come up with an identification for this empid. And I'm only giving you this one photo, so but just look at the lower mandible color. Give you some hints. Look at the eye ring. Look at the overall color of the bird. And then in this photo, you can't really see the wings and tail very well.
Hey, Dave, while they're thinking about it, there was a question about how do you record bird songs in the field? I think they want to know what your personal experience is.
Oh, for recording bird sounds. I just use my phone. It's really handy. I have a Samsung, and there's an app called RecForge 2 that's really handy because you can record sounds on it, and it will save the date and time just automatically for you. It'll name your file that. So RecForge 2, and I can write this down, and I'll maybe at the end I can if anyone wants to know more about that, I can write it down. But I know it's a little bit different on iPhones, like what app is the best, and they have a built-in voice memo on iPhone, which I've been told is pretty good as long as you adjust the settings accordingly, and so that your phone doesn't filter just for human voices. But I don't know all the details on that. And I also know there's a lot of recording setups. You know, if you talk to Nathan Peplow, or someone who records a lot more than I do, you can get set up specifically just for recordings beyond just your phone.
David, I'll just quickly mention that the CFO has a workshop on that issue, on that question, and you can listen to all the past workshops on the CFO Facebook page.
Yeah, that's a great,
on the CFO website.
Yeah, that's a great point. Go to Nathan Peplow's talk, which was in April.
So can you take us through how you would have identified this bird?
Yeah. So when I look at this bird, I see the kind of almond-shaped eye ring. I see a point in the back. I see an entirely orange, kind of pale lower mandible, and it's kind of olive green, kind of bright. It has yellow tones throughout, and it makes me think Cordilleran flycatcher, which is in fact what this is. It is a Cordilleran flycatcher that I photographed in far southwestern Kansas, actually, during migration. Okay, so I said test your hand in Empid ID, but I'm kind of giving this one away because it's not an Empid. So yeah, it should be labeled test your flycatcher ID. And that should basically lead you to, this is a Western wood-pewee. It's got kind of weak wing bars. It's really dark and gray and just kind of no colored tones at all. You actually can't see the primary projection that well, but it's got really long wings. But I think the main helpful thing here is it's just really, really great. No colored tones at all to it. And also no eye ring also. All right, so here's the last quiz. And both the wood-pewee before this and this bird here, I actually photographed earlier today in Pueblo County. So maybe that's a hint. They're both migrants. And this one's challenging, I will say. This is definitely not the best angle for Empid ID. So I won't spend too much time on this one, actually. I will say there's almost no iron. So it's kind of, if you compare it to the pewee before, you can kind of see greenish tones in it. You can kind of see kind of brownish tones. Does not look as just gray, like just dark gray, like that pewee. It's kind of very faint, just almost no ironing. It's got a slight crest. Well, this is a willow flycatcher. This is a Traill's. The Traill's flycatcher, most likely a willow flycatcher. It's a large build for an Empid, but almost no ironing. Okay, well, this isn't as bad as some cases can be. I just thought it would be fun to show this picture because I thought this was a really dull example of a Cordilleran flycatcher. And this is in late summer, so it's a really worn individual. Doesn't look nearly as bright, kind of olive as some of the others can look. This one was vocalizing, so it's singing and giving call notes that are distinctive for Cordilleran flycatcher. But it's really gray for a Cordilleran flycatcher. Okay, so this almost concludes my little talk here, a little presentation on flycatchers. So we went over kingbirds, the 3 species of kingbird we get in Colorado: eastern, western, Caston's kingbird. We went over the Myiarchus flycatchers, the 2 species we get here, ash-throated flycatcher and great-crested flycatcher. We went over Phoebes, Say's eastern and black. Then we went over wood-pewees and olive-sided flycatcher, which is a pewee. And we talked about how to separate wood-pewees from empids. And then we went through the full list of empids, of empid species that breed or regularly migrate through Colorado, which are these 7 species here. And alder almost doesn't count because it only migrates through a little bit in the eastern edge of the state. And just for fun, here's some vagrant flycatchers in Colorado. They don't regularly breed in the state. So here on the left side, you've got, and these are the more flashy examples of some of the cool vagrants that we've had in Colorado, which I think is kind of fun. So here's vermilion flycatcher, a nice bright male, and then here's a female vermilion flycatcher below that. As you can see, quite different looking than the male. More nondescript. Here's a fork-tailed flycatcher from Boulder, which is Diane Roberts' photo, and nice photo from Sue Rife in flight of a scissor-tailed flycatcher, and then my own scissor-tailed flycatcher photo here. And these show up rarely, just a few in the state each year, but they don't regularly occur in the state. I figured since we've been going through empids and gray flycatcher and all the difficulties in identification for that, we may as well end with some really cool, bright flycatchers. And my so photo credits
I used photos from Caleb Strand, Diane Roberts, Martina Nordstrand, Market Muchler, Ryan Andrews, and Sue Reif. So thank you to those people. And thank you to the CFO for hosting me here, and to Nick, and for all of you for tuning in this evening. And I'll just point you, before we get to questions, I'll just point you to a few sources that I like to use. So Macaulay Library, there's a lot of sounds in it. Merlin Bird ID, the app, which you can install on your phone. Sibley, the app. So those two have sounds that you can refer to, as does the Macaulay Library. Xenocanto has sounds. And then Stephen Mlanoff has a really interesting collection of photos that showing Traill's flycatchers, if you want to look into that at some point. And that concludes the slides part of my presentation. So I'll open it up to questions, which I'm very happy to answer. So if you want to type in chat, or unmute yourself, that works too.
Diana Beatty asks, would you be willing to play breeding songs for Empids?
Reading songs for Empids. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I kind of figured someone would maybe want that. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so here's Dusky Flycatcher. A little quiet. Let's see. There's a falcon in one of those recordings. So that's a good example right there of Dusky Flycatcher song. You'll hear that in Ponderosa, open Ponderosa pine forest now through the end of summer, like July. So notice how that that song ended on a high note. It ended on a really high note. Hammond's Flycatcher songs are really similar. They're just a little bit softer, and most of the time they end on a low note. I'll just show you. So they'll do that, which is similar, and they'll just do it kind of over and over again repetitively. And they won't do that high note that Dusky likes to throw in at the end. That's a great example. That sounds like the Hammond's Flycatchers I hear. This recording right here. it's similar, but then just it's a little bit different. It's and a little bit softer. It's kind of a weaker song than Dusky Flycatcher usually. I'll go to Cordilleran next. Didn't hear anything there. Let's see. Those are both good examples of the start. That's kind of the start of a Cordilleran song. Here it is. So you'll hear them do that on territory a lot. Kind of two notes, second note higher than the first. And they've got another song type, but that's the one that you usually hear. So least flycatcher, let's listen to the Chebec song that they give. And often they'll do this. So I haven't heard Dusky Flycatcher, Hammond's Flycatcher, Cordilleran Flycatcher. I've never heard those. And most Empids, actually, I've not heard them make songs during migration, but least flycatchers will sing during migration sometimes.
And willows too.
Yeah, exactly. That was a good first recording there. Right there. So just kind of two notes repeated. They're not super high pitched like Cordilleran. It's a Chebec, I like to call it. And then, like Nick said, willow flycatchers will sing on migration sometimes, but not always. Usually they don't. That's a great example. Man, I love that recording. That is good.
David.
Yeah.
John Chanot asked the question, given the rarity of alder flycatcher in Colorado, is it appropriate to report on eBird a silent bird in this group as a willow, or do you always report it as trails?
You should always report it as trails, unless you get recordings. And sometimes if you get really good photos, you might be able to tell. But you should report those as, sorry, I'm thinking of trails. So let's see. But yeah, I hope that that answers that. And now I'll look at alder flycatcher's song, so you can compare it to willow flycatcher. And willow flycatcher we like to kind of call a Fitzbew. And I actually learning the song of, okay, well, let me actually, I'll just play it first. I don't know if there's an alder flycatcher further in there, but there wasn't any. There was a least flycatcher in that recording. Let's see. There was a least flycatcher also in that recording. There we go. And there's that's a good recording.
Well, David, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other questions come up, so I will just say this, that you're beyond your years in flycatcher wisdom, and keep up the great work. And thank you very much for giving us this presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening in tonight.